The courtroom fell silent as the young boy's voice rang out, clear and unwavering. "You're my mom." His words seemed to hang in the air, wrapping themselves around the judge seated high above him. For a moment, everything seemed frozen. The gavel in her hand trembled slightly before it fell onto the bench with a loud crack. Judge Evelyn Carter's face shifted from stern professionalism to something raw and deeply personal. Tears brimmed in her eyes, and before anyone could speak or move, one rolled down her cheek. The spectators whispered amongst themselves, their hushed voices full of shock and intrigue. Who was this boy? And why did he believe the judge, the woman known for her firm, no-nonsense demeanor, was his mother? The judge blinked rapidly, shaking her head as if to clear her thoughts. "Young man," she began, her voice cracking under the weight of emotion. "What did you just say?" The boy, no older than 10, stepped forward bravely, his hands clutching a tattered photo. His small frame seemed dwarfed by the vast courtroom, but his determination was larger than life. "You're my mom," he repeated, holding the picture out for her to see. "You're the lady in my picture. My grandma told me all about you. You left me when I was a baby." Gasps echoed through the room as everyone strained to catch a glimpse of the photograph. Judge Carter's hand flew to her mouth, and her body shook as if the weight of his words were too much to bear. The bailiff moved toward the boy, but the judge raised a trembling hand to stop him. "Let him stay," she whispered. Her heart pounded like a drum in her chest as she slowly descended from the bench, her heels clicking against the cold, tiled floor. When she reached the boy, she hesitated before taking the picture from his outstretched hand. She stared at it for what felt like an eternity, her tears now flowing freely. It was her. In the photo, a younger version of herself smiled, cradling a baby wrapped in a soft blue blanket. Her hands trembled as she clutched the image to her chest. The courtroom was alive with tension, every person on the edge of their seat. But no one dared to speak. "Is it true?" the boy asked, his voice breaking the heavy silence. "Are you really my mom?" Before Judge Carter could answer, the courtroom doors flew open, slamming against the walls. A man stormed in, his face red with anger and desperation. "You have no right to speak to him," he yelled, pointing at the boy. The boy flinched, and the judge turned toward the man, her protective instincts kicking in like a reflex. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice trembling but firm. "I'm his father," the man shouted, "and you have no idea what you've just done." Earlier, that morning, Ethan had been holding onto the picture for as long as he could remember. The edges were frayed, the colors fading, but it was his most prized possession. It was the only connection he had to a woman he'd never met, the woman he called Mom in his dreams. His grandmother Ruth had raised him since he was a baby. She was the one who'd handed him the photo years ago, her voice tinged with sorrow. "This is your mother, Evelyn. She couldn't stay, but she loved you." Ethan would stare at the picture every night, imagining the kind of woman she was. In his mind, she was kind and beautiful, someone who made the best pancakes and told the funniest jokes. But reality was different. She was a stranger. One day, Ruth sat Ethan down and told him the truth. "Your mother's not just anyone, Ethan," she said, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "She's Judge Evelyn Carter. She's a very important woman." Ethan's heart raced. His mom wasn't just someone out there in the world. She was a person people looked up to, someone who made big decisions. But if she was so important, why hadn't she come for him? "Why did she leave me?" he asked softly. Ruth sighed deeply, her frail hands clutching his. "Sometimes people make choices because they think it's what's best, but it doesn't mean they don't love you." Ethan didn't fully understand, but he knew one thing. He had to find her. The opportunity came when Ruth fell ill. The hospital bills piled up, and Ethan overheard Ruth's doctor mentioning a legal case involving financial aid. The case was set to be heard in Judge Evelyn Carter's courtroom. It felt like fate. With a mix of hope and fear, Ethan decided he would go. Ruth tried to stop him, but her weak protest couldn't hold back his determination. "I have to know," he told her, his small hands gripping hers tightly. "I have to see her." That morning, Ethan slipped the photo into his pocket and made his way to the courthouse. The grand building loomed over him, intimidating and cold, But he didn't let it stop him. Inside, he spotted Judge Carter almost immediately. She was powerful and commanding, her every move radiating authority. But all Ethan could see was the woman in his picture, the mother he'd imagined for so long. The proceedings began, but Ethan couldn't wait any longer. When the room quieted, he stood up, his small voice cutting through the stillness. "You're my mom," he said. And just like that, his life and hers changed forever. The present. The man in the doorway marched toward Ethan, his face twisted with rage. "You don't know what you're talking about, kid," he bellowed. Ethan shrank back, his earlier courage faltering. Judge Carter stepped between them, her hand held out protectively. "That's enough," she said, her voice firm. But the man wasn't done. "You think you can just walk in here and claim him?" he spat. "You don't know what he's been through." Judge Carter's eyes narrowed. "Who are you?" she repeated. "I'm his legal guardian," the man snarled, "and you've just opened a can of worms you can't close." The tension in the row was unbearable. Ethan's eyes darted between the judge and the man, fear and confusion etched on his face. Judge Carter's mind raced, her heart breaking for the boy who had just turned her world upside down. "Ethan," she said softly, turning to him. "Is this true? Is he your guardian?" The boy nodded hesitantly. "He lives with me and Grandma," he admitted. Judge Carter's gaze snapped back to the man. "We're going to settle this right now," she declared, her voice firm and unwavering. "And I want the truth." The man smirked, his confidence returning. "Be careful what you wish for, Judge," he said, his tone dripping with malice. But before he could say more, the courtroom doors opened again. This time it was Ruth, Ethan's grandmother, her frail frame supported by a nurse. Her eyes locked on the judge, and her expression was a mix of guilt and hope. "Evelyn," she said, her voice trembling. "We need to talk." The room fell silent once more, the weight of her words hanging heavily in the air. The courtroom felt like it was holding its breath. Ruth's sudden appearance seemed to change everything, her frail figure adding a new layer of tension to an already charged scene. Ethan's eyes widened when he saw his grandmother, and a flicker of worry crossed his face. Judge Evelyn Carter, still gripping the photograph, froze for a moment, then stepped aside to allow the elderly woman to approach. "Mrs. Turner, is it?" Judge Carter asked, her voice barely masking the storm of emotions threatening to engulf her. "You're his grandmother?" Ruth nodded slowly, her trembling hands clutching the nurse's arm for support. "I am," she whispered, her voice carrying a weight of sorrow. Her eyes darted between Ethan and the man claiming to be his guardian, before settling on the judge. "And so are you." The courtroom exploded in gasps and whispers, the noise echoing off the wall, as like ripples in a pond. Evelyn's hand flew to her chest as if the words had physically struck her. Her carefully constructed walls of professionalism and composure were crumbling fast. The man stepped forward angrily, pointing an accusing finger at Ruth. "What are you doing, old woman? You don't know what you're saying." "I know exactly what I'm saying," Ruth shot back, her frail voice gaining strength. "This boy deserves the truth, and I won't leave this world without him knowing it." Evelyn's knees threatened to buckle. She forced herself to steady, clutching the bench for support. "Someone explain," she demanded, her voice sharp but unsteady. "Right now." Ruth sighed, and with the nurse's help eased herself into a seat near the judge's bench. She took a deep breath and began. 20 years ago, Evelyn, you were just a young woman. Smart, ambitious, but life threw you a curveball. You were pregnant and scared, unsure of how to handle it all. And then, he came along. She nodded toward the man who now glared at her with unmasked contempt. Evelyn's hands gripped the edges of the photo. Her mind reeled as fragmented memories began to surface. Memories she had worked so hard to bury. "You mean Ethan's father?" she asked, her voice trembling. "No," Ruth replied sharply, her gaze darkening. "Not his father. This man, Daniel Morgan. He was the reason you had to leave." Ethan's small voice broke in. "Grandma, what does she mean?" he asked, looking back and forth between the judge and Ruth. Ruth hesitated, guilt written all over her face. "Ethan," she said softly, "when your mother was pregnant with you, I thought I was protecting her. I thought I was doing what was best for both of you. Judge Carter's breath hitched. You told me I had no choice, she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. You said giving up the baby was the only way. Ruth nodded miserably. I did. And I let him get involved, she said, jerking her chin toward Daniel. I thought he could handle things, keep it quiet. But I had no idea what kind of man he really was. Evelyn turned to Daniel, her eyes narrowing. What exactly did you do? She demanded, her voice hardening. Nothing illegal, Daniel said, smirking. But sometimes people need a little persuasion. Let's just say I helped Ruth convince you to leave the boy with her and move on with your life. You wanted to be a lawyer, right? A judge? That wouldn't have happened with a kid holding you back. You lied to me, Evelyn whispered, horror dawning on her face. And I lied to him, Ruth admitted, tears streaming down her face as she glanced at Ethan. I told you your mother abandoned you, but that was never the truth. She turned back to Evelyn, her voice breaking. You thought I was looking out for you, but I let this man manipulate us both. And when you left, he convinced me to keep quiet so I wouldn't ruin your career. The courtroom buzzed with whispers again, but Ethan's small voice cut through it all. So she didn't leave me because she didn't love me. Ruth shook her head, her frailty evident in the motion. No, sweetheart. Your mother loved you. She still loves you. Evelyn dropped to her knees, coming eye level with Ethan. Her carefully crafted persona as Judge Carter fell away completely, replaced by a vulnerable woman overcome with guilt and love. Ethan, she said, her voice shaking, if I had known, if I had even guessed, I never would have left you. I never stopped thinking about you. I never stopped. She broke off, her tears making it impossible to continue. Daniel clapped sarcastically, cutting through the moment. Touching, really, he sneered. But none of this changes the facts. Legally, he's under my care now, and you've got no claim to him, Judge. So don't even think about trying. Evelyn shot to her feet, glaring at him. If you think for one second I'm letting you near this boy again, you're sorely mistaken, she said, steel returning to her voice. And what are you going to do about it? Daniel taunted. Call the cops? Good luck. As far as the law is concerned, I'm still his guardian. Ruth's voice, faint but defiant, cut through the tension. Not for much longer. She reached into her purse, pulling out a thick envelope and placing it on the judge's bench. I've been documenting everything. Every threat, every shady deal he's made. It's all there. I've been waiting for the right time to stop him for good. Daniel's face turned white. You can't prove anything. I don't need to, Evelyn said coldly, picking up the envelope. But the district attorney might. Daniel's bravado crumbled as the weight of her words sank in. He glared at Ruth, then at Evelyn, before turning and storming out of the courtroom. The heavy doors slammed shut behind him, leaving the room in silence. Evelyn turned back to Ethan, her heart breaking as she saw the fear in his eyes. I'm going to fix this, she promised. I don't know how yet, but I will. Ethan hesitated before stepping closer, his small arms wrapping around her. I just want a mom, he whispered. Evelyn held him tightly, her tears soaking into his hair. You've always had one, she said. And you always will. The emotional moment was interrupted by the sound of Ruth's frail voice gasping. Everyone turned as she clutched her chest, her face contorted in pain. Grandma, Ethan cried, running to her side. The nurse was already calling for an ambulance as Evelyn knelt beside Ruth, who was struggling to breathe. Evelyn, Ruth managed, gripping her hand weakly. I'm so sorry. For everything. Please, take care of him. Ruth, stay with me, Evelyn said urgently, but Ruth's eyes began to flutter closed, her breath growing shallower. The sound of sirens grew closer as the courtroom erupted in chaos. The air outside the hospital was heavy with rain, its relentless pattering drowning out the distant sound of traffic. Inside, in the sterile fluorescent light of the emergency waiting room, Ethan sat with his head buried in his knees. Judge Evelyn Carter sat beside him, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. She couldn't stop replaying the chaotic events of the courtroom. Ruth's words, her collapse, everything felt like a blur. Is she going to be okay? Ethan's small voice broke through the silence. Evelyn tightened her grip on his shoulder, swallowing the lump in her throat. "The doctors are doing everything they can," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Ethan turned to her, his eyes red-rimmed and filled with fear. "But what if she doesn't make it? What's going to happen to me?" Evelyn knelt in front of him, her hands on his. "Listen to me, Ethan. No matter what happens, I won't let you go through this alone. You're my son. I won't leave you again." Her words hung in the air, heavy with the promise she'd only now allowed herself to make. Ethan studied her face for a moment before nodding, some of his fear melting into a fragile trust. The waiting felt endless, but finally, a doctor approached them. His expression was serious but not grim, which gave Evelyn a small sliver of hope. "She's stable," he said, glancing at Ethan with a warm smile. "But it was a close call. Mrs. Turner suffered a heart attack, likely brought on by stress. She's conscious now, but she'll need rest and a lot of care going forward." Relief washed over Ethan's face, and Evelyn felt her own shoulders relax for the first time in hours. "Can we see her?" she asked. The doctor nodded. "For a few minutes, but keep it brief. She's still very weak." Ethan dashed toward Ruth's room, Evelyn following close behind. When they entered, Ruth looked frail and tired, her skin pale against the crisp white of the hospital sheets. But her eyes lit up when she saw Ethan. "Grandma!" Ethan cried, rushing to her side. He took her hand gently, as if afraid she might break. Ruth smiled weakly. "Hey there, sweetheart," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "Tough little guy, aren't you?" Evelyn stayed near the door, watching the tender exchange. The sight of Ethan and Ruth together tugged at her heart, filling her with a profound sense of loss for all the moments she had missed. After a while, Ruth turned her gaze to Evelyn. "Can I speak to her alone, Ethan?" she asked softly. Ethan hesitated, but Ruth gave him an encouraging nod. "It's okay, love. Just wait right outside." Once Ethan was gone, Ruth's expression grew serious. She motioned for Evelyn to come closer. "You need to take him," Ruth said firmly. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. "Ruth, no," Ruth interrupted, her voice resolute despite its weakness. "I made mistakes, terrible ones, but you have a chance to make things right. He needs you, Evelyn, and you need him." Evelyn sat on the edge of the bed, taking Ruth's frail hand in hers. "I want to," she admitted, her voice breaking. "But Daniel, he's still out there, and the law—" "Forget Daniel," Ruth said fiercely, surprising Evelyn with her sudden strength. "You're a judge. You know how to fight. Don't let that man keep hurting Ethan." Evelyn nodded, determination settling into her bones. "I'll do whatever it takes to protect him." "That's all I needed to hear," Ruth said, her lips curling into a small smile before her eyes drifted closed in exhaustion. Evelyn stepped out of the room to find Ethan waiting anxiously in the hallway. She crouched down in front of him, brushing a hand through his hair. "She's going to rest now," she said gently. "Can we go back tomorrow?" Ethan asked. Evelyn smiled. "Of course, but first, there's something I need to take care of." The next morning, Evelyn walked into her office, her arms loaded with paperwork. She wasn't Judge Carter today. She was just Evelyn, a mother fighting for her son. She had spent the night combing through the documents Ruth had given her, compiling every piece of evidence she could find against Daniel. And now, she had a plan. That same day, Evelyn filed an emergency petition to remove Daniel as Ethan's guardian, citing the evidence of abuse and neglect Ruth had collected. She also made arrangements to take temporary custody of Ethan, determined to ensure his safety while the legal battles unfolded. Daniel didn't take it quietly. The day Evelyn's petition was granted, he stormed into the courthouse, his face flushed with rage. "This isn't over, Carter," he shouted as security escorted him out. But Evelyn wasn't afraid. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of clarity and purpose. She was fighting for Ethan, and that made her unstoppable. The days turned into weeks, and slowly, a new rhythm began to form. Evelyn and Ethan navigated their new lives together, learning each other's quirks and forming a bond that grew stronger with each passing day. One evening, after dinner, Evelyn found Ethan in her study, staring at the old photograph that had brought them together. She sat beside him, her heart swelling with both love and regret. "Do you still miss the mom you imagined?" she asked gently. Ethan looked at her, his small face thoughtful. "I think you're better than the mom I imagined," he said. Evelyn blinked back tears and pulled him into a tight hug. "I promise, Ethan, I'll never leave you again," she whispered. And for the first time in a long time, Evelyn knew she wasn't just promising him. She was promising herself. The months ahead were not easy. Evelyn fought hard in court to terminate Daniel's guardianship, presenting Ruth's evidence and her own testimony. It wasn't just about proving her fitness as a mother. It was about ensuring Ethan's safety and giving him the stability he deserved. In the end, Evelyn won. The court officially declared her Ethan's legal guardian, and Daniel was barred from contacting him again. It was a victory that brought a flood of emotions, relief, joy, and a deep sense of vindication. Ruth lived long enough to see Evelyn and Ethan finally become a family. On her last day, she held Ethan's hand, her gaze filled with love and pride. "You're going to be okay," she told him. "You've got the best mom in the world now." Evelyn and Ethan stood together at Ruth's grave, their hands entwined. It wasn't the ending either of them had imagined, but it was a beginning. A new chapter filled with hope and love. And as they walked away from the cemetery, Evelyn squeezed Ethan's hand and said, "Let's go home." For the first time, the word home felt complete for both of them.